Hello, happy Friday, and welcome to Automation Hour. I'm Jen Lee, and if you're joining us for the first time, all lines are muted. Please post any questions that you have out on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour, and we'll take your questions towards the end of the session. It could be anything related to this presentation or any process automation questions that you have. We will post a recording out to the Salesforce Automation Hour, as well as our YouTube channel and our website Automation Hour sometime after the session. So if you haven't signed up for our sessions for the rest of the year, we are completely booked out. So even if you can't attend live, I recommend registering, and then you'll get the link to the posting after the fact. But we have some really great NBPs, community users, as well as some first-time presenters on. And also, if you have a business use case with a cool process automation that you would like to share with those in the ecosystem, reach out to us directly and we'll get you scheduled into a future session. And we cannot bring this webinar series to you free without our sponsor, Concrete.io. So thank you for sponsoring us. And here are your co-hosts, David Litton, myself, and Rakesh Gupta. And if you happen to be going to Trailhead DX, Texas Dreamin', or Midwest Dreamin', you'll be able to catch one of us, hopefully. Come by and say hi, attend our sessions, and introduce yourself to us. And with that, we're excited to have Narender on to present with us. He's a first-time presenter on Automation Hour, so looking forward to his presentation today on flows and managed sharing. So with that, let me hand this over to Narender. So you should have control now. Great, I see your presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. So, can you please verify if my screen is visible to you?
It looks good.
Yep, that's good.
Awesome. So, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Narender Singh. I work as a Salesforce admin and developer at Miri Infotech, based out of New Delhi, India. I am a blogger at forcepanda.wordpress.com and also a co-leader of Delhi Administrators User Group. So let's quickly take a look at today's agenda. And today we will kick off by discussing how sharing of records is handled at the backend in Salesforce, and having some clarity on sharing fundamental. We shall then further dive into our use case for today, and we'll see how we can solve it. So, understanding sharing. So we are all familiar with the term sharing in the context of Salesforce. So sharing basically enables record level access control for all custom objects, as well as many standard objects, for example, accounts, contacts, leads, opportunities, etc. So primarily in Salesforce, we have three types of sharing, which is managed sharing, user managed sharing, which is also known as manual sharing, and then we have the third one as Apex managed sharing. So managed sharing basically involves the sharing access that is granted implicitly by the Salesforce platform based on the record ownership, role hierarchy, and sharing rules. User managed sharing, on the other hand, allows the record owner or any user with full access to that record to share that record with a user or a group of users. And then the third one that we have is Apex managed sharing, which provides the developers the ability to share their records programmatically via Apex and SOAP API. And then there are various access levels for a shared record, and those are private, read only, read write, and full access. Private basically means that the record is private and only the record owner can have the access to it. Read only simply signifies that the access level is only denied to the view mode and you cannot make any changes to the record. Read and write means that you can view the record and edit it as well. Whereas the full access implies that the user can read, edit, delete, and also happen to transfer the record ownership if he wants to. So this was a very basic overview of sharing. Now let us understand what really happens at the back end when a record is shared in Salesforce. So for every object in Salesforce, custom or standard, where we can implement record sharing, there is another standard object associated with it which stores the record sharing information. So for example, if we have our standard account object, then the corresponding object will be account share. And we'll quickly look into this what account share holds. And similarly for custom object, there will be a corresponding custom object share record, and it will be as denoted as custom object underscore the name of the custom object underscore share. So let's see what really what this share record holds is the ID of the shared record, the access level, and the ID of the user or the group with whom the record is to be shared with. So every time a record is shared by a user or implicitly or explicitly, a new record is created in the share object. So now let us take a look at our use case for today. So Force Panda is an organization who has been using Salesforce for a long time to support their business. And they recently rolled out to Lightning, and but soon it was brought to their attention that the Lightning does not support manual sharing. And manual sharing was extensively used by the users of Force Panda, and we all know how users can be at times. So you know the whole picture. So now we have Stacy who works as a Salesforce administrator at Force Panda, and she is tasked to figure out a solution to enable her users to share account records on a button click. So after hours of scratching her head, she finally figured out that the answer to all her problems is, any guesses? Flows. So yes, Flows is a great tool which provides an admin various tools that can be used for achieving complex automation simply with using clicks and not code. So it's time for us to grab our whiteboard, clean our whiteboards, grab our markers, because no flow solution is complete without a flow chart. So first and the very foremost step is to launch the flow. So since the user is expecting to click a button to initiate the whole process, so it only makes sense that we launch the flow via quick action. Once the flow is launched, the next step is to prompt the user to select the users with whom the user wants to share the record with. So in the flow, we will have a screen where the user with whom the user will be interacting and selecting the users with whom the record he wants to share with. Then we'll simply put a null check to ensure that there is at least one user selected and based on the selection of the number of users, we will carry forward. So if there is no user selected, we can simply stop this or pop up a warning, or we can simply navigate the user back to the screen to select the users. Once the user has selected all the users with whom the record is to be shared with, we will run a loop. So the loop will basically have we will run a loop over all the selected users, and for each iteration we will be having we will be extracting one user ID for each iteration, and then using that user ID we will be creating a share record and add that record to a collection. Now we will go over the same process until we have iterated over all these selected user records. Once we have once we have our loop completed, we can simply move forward and use that collection variable to create the records, and that brings us to the stop or of our flow. So now let's quickly jump into our demo, and let's see how we can build it from scratch. So here I am in my dev and also I am logged in with another user who is a standard user. So first we'll quickly start building our flow, and we'll see what are the necessary steps which we need to make our flow going. So first, and the very first step that we discussed, was to present the user with the list of users. So we'll select a multi-select. We'll use a checkbox group. Select users to share the record. Now here we will create a dynamic record choice variable. Basically, that is a record choice variable. Since I've used CloudFlow Designer for a long time, hence the difficulty with the names. So the object that we will be using will be user, and we are going to set some conditions. To begin with, our user must be active. Also, we don't want to share the record. Also, we don't want to share the record with ourselves. So we don't want our name to be in that list. So for that, we don't need our name. So we will add another condition where ID of the user is not equal to current user's ID. So here we will need to create another formula variable which I'll be creating just after this. And then also we need to take care of one another name which usually pops up. and that is the automated process. And let's sort the name with name. So the label for our choices will be obviously name. The data type for the value will be text, and we'll be using the user ID as the value behind the scenes. So we'll quickly create a formula variable which will say current user ID, where current user ID text, and we will use this formula variable in our screen. So once we have that, the next step is to check whether the user has selected some users or not. So basically, we'll use a decision element, and before using that decision element, we'll have to create a formula variable to check the length of the selected users. So basically, this is a bit of information that we need to take care of, that how the IDs are stored when the user is selecting the various users from the checkbox group. So how they are really managed in that string variable is that all the IDs are separated by a semicolon. So all the 18-digit user IDs will be separated by a semicolon. So for example, if we have ID 1, if we have three IDs, then the it will look something like this: ID 1, ID 2, ID 3. So we will take advantage of the syntax and use this and extract the IDs from this string variable. So now we will be creating a formula variable to calculate the length of the variable which will hold the value of the selected user IDs. Now we will use a decision element to check whether the length of the selected user ID is 0 or greater than 0. If it's greater than 0, we'll continue our loop. If it's not greater than 0, then we'll simply pop up a warning message to the user to please select at least more than one user. So we'll simply use this screen to display a text, information text, to give a warning to the user. Please select these molecules. Now the next step would be is to have a variable created. We will create a text type variable and store the IDs that we got from the selected user screen. So basically what we will be doing is collecting we will be copying the values from the checkbox group field to a text type variable. So we'll simply create a variable selected user IDs, and then we'll use an assignment element to copy the values from the screen element checkbox group element that we used in our screen into this text variable. Now having done that, this is the part where we will create a loop without actually using a loop element. So this is another interesting way that you can use to create a loop. So basically what we will do is we'll use a decision element which will check on the size or the length of the variable which we are using to calculate the length of the selected user IDs, and if it's greater than 0 we'll keep iterating, and once the size of the variable size or the length of the variable is less than or equal to 0 we'll exit out of the loop. So less talking and more doing. Now the idea is, once we have the decision element set up, the idea is to extract the ID from the variable that we created here, the text variable here the selected user IDs. So we will now create a formula variable which will extract the 18-digit user IDs from this variable. So basically what left formula does is it will extract the first 18 letters starting from the left of the var selected user IDs variable. Now the next step is to create the account share record that will hold the user ID and the ID of the record with whom this record is to be shared with. So since in our use case we are working on account object. So, okay, so the what we are going to do here is we'll create a record variable of account share type and we will use that variable over each iteration and store the values in that variable and add it to collection for each iteration. So first of all we'll need to create the record variable. Now we will use the assignment element to add values to the account share record. So account ID will be the ID of the record from which the flow will be launched. So for that, we will have to create a record called, we will have to create a variable of text type with name record ID. Please do mind that the record ID variable name is case sensitive and make sure you have the correct name of this variable. So what happens is that when you create this variable and mark this as available for input, this variable gets automatically populated with the ID of the variable which is in the context. So basically if we are launching the flow from the record screen, the ID of that record will be automatically populated or copied into the value of this record ID variable. So this is the so account level is the field where we set the value, or let's say if you want to give the access as read write, and then for case access level, we do not want to give any kind of access. So now user or group ID is the field which will contain the ID of the record, ID of the user or the group with whom the record is to be shared with. And since we use that formula variable to extract the 18 digit ID, we will use that ID here. So where user ID was the variable that we used. Then the last thing which is really important is the row cause. So row cause is something which is a field which contains the reason sharing for the sharing of record. So for example, if you have, since we are intending to share the record manually, so we'll use the manual sharing as the value of this field. So this creates our account share record. So the next step is to add this account share record to a collection variable. So let's quickly create a collection variable with of account record, account share type. Now having done that, we know the next step is to add that wake, add that record variable, account shared record variable to the collection variable that we created. But the very important thing that we need to note here is that how are we going to run the loop, and how are we going to extract that ID. And then the next step is, once we have the ID of the first user extracted, the idea is to remove that ID from that string variable that is containing all the IDs. So as I mentioned, all the IDs, all the 18 digit user IDs are separated by a semicolon. So we will use that to our advantage, and we will create a formula variable, another formula variable. I know it's a lot of variables, and we will use that formula variable to update the value of the selected record user ID variable. So basically, another formula variable. So what basically I'm doing here is, if uh, we know that the IDs are separated by a semicolon. So if once we are when we are extracting the IDs, and then once the over each iteration we'll use that, remove that ID from that variable. So along with that we will also remove the semicolon. So at the end we will be left with the only ID and there will be no semicolon. So we'll use a if function, and accordingly we will check if the where selected user ID variable contains the semicolon, then we will remove the ID plus the semicolon, otherwise we will simply remove the ID or basically substitute the ID. And this is where the substitute function comes into the picture. So if it contains too many brackets and it's really difficult to create the formulas, so I'll simply use the existing formula and not to get confused with. So this is the variable and the formula that I'm using in this variable. So basically first we are removing all the spaces here, and then the if function is first checking if the selected user ID variable is containing a semicolon. If the semicolon is present, then we are substituting the current variable user ID and the semicolon from that existing variable. So when we continue doing so, in the end we will left with only one ID at the end. So hence that ID, so at that point of time the ID variable will not be having any semicolon present but the only ID. So therefore the second else condition, where we have the substitute function without the semicolon, so it will only substitute the ID and we will be left with nothing. So the size of or the length of that variable will reduce to 0. I hope I'm making sense with all the formulas and the variables. So the next step is to use the another assignment element. First we'll add the account share variable. Then we will update d equals updated user IDs. Now the final step would be to create records using the collection variable that we had. And finally, we'll simply put a screen with success message. Okay, so that completes our flow, and you can see how we created the loop using the decision element and without having to actually use a loop element. So the next step is to save this flow. Now the final step would be to create a quick action on the account record and add it to the page layout. So we'll quickly create a action. I believe I already have one. Okay, we need to activate the flow as well in order to get the flow in the quick action. So that sets up our flow. Now I have another user logged in as Master Shifu. So Master Shifu is a standard user in this organization and does not have only have a few accounts under his belt. So we'll see if we can successfully share another account record with Shifu. So let's say we create another record for automation R. So this is the only user that I am having currently active in my organization. So that's why you are only seeing this user. Okay, I sense an error is coming. Okay, there might be some infinite loop going on. So what basically this flow builder looks like is I have a similar one created over here. So we'll use that. It's pretty much similar to what we had done. So this is the record sharing screen that you see once you launch the flow. So let's refresh our screen. So let's share this record with Shifu and let's see if we are able to successfully do it. So it says the record shared successfully. So now if you copy this ID and as if you could see there were only two accounts this user could see. Now if you refresh your screen, you will see another account with the name Automation R. And if you can see the owner's last name is Force. So still the owner of the record is Force Panda, but the record is being shared with Master Shifu as well. And just to give you a glimpse what happens in the back end, I would also like to show you something interesting. So if we copy the ID and run a query on account sharing record for all those developers or for all those who have an idea about SOQL. So if we put a query and use that query, we will see that there are two records under account share standard object, and this object is containing the name and the ID of the records which are being shared, and also with the users with whom it is being shared. You can also query the access 11 and the other stuff, obviously. So I believe that's it for today's webinar. I hope I was able to explain the whole use case and the solution. Thank you.
Cool.
Jennifer?
Thanks, Narender. All right, so while we wait to see if anyone has any questions, you can post them out to the Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community or on the GoToWebinar. I do have one question, and it is, do you have any idea what limits we need to keep in mind for this use case?
Can you please repeat the question, please?
Sorry. Do you have any idea what limits we need to keep in mind with implementing this use case?
So all the standard limits which you are following when you are sharing a record, as you do in the Apex managed sharing, if you have any idea about that, those will always imply. Other than that, there are no limits as an admin that you need to follow. For example, let's say if there is a X limit that a record can be shared with only this many users, only then that kind of limit would be imposed. But as far as I know, there is no such limit that you need to keep in mind for this particular use case.
Okay. And any tips on going and testing the solution?
The best way to test your solution is to debug your flow. I always do that. So I would also like to show it to the others. So the best and the always which usually works for everyone is to debug your flow, because once when you are debugging your flow, you are seeing each and every step as, in terms of what is happening in your flow. So you can quickly supply in the record IDs, and then you can see what all users that you are selecting and what all iterations that are happening. So this is the best possible way that you can test your flow uh, and debug it as well. And of course, then you have the sand. Also, the best way to start with the testing of flows is in the sandbox, of course. Also, a very important point to note here is when you are debugging your flow, the changes are being made the changes that are being made in the debug, while in the debug those changes are also reflected into your database. So let's say if you are updating a value in a debug while debugging a flow, those values will get updated in the backend or your Salesforce database. So make sure you have a good make sure you are testing your flow always on the test data and not the real data that you have in your organization.
Yes, don't run debug in production. Okay, let me give a refresh to the Trailblazer community. In the meantime, Jennifer Weaver said this was really slick. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, last call for any type of questions folks may have.
No.
I don't see any.
Everyone is excited for the long weekend.
Yep. All right. So with that, I'm not going to keep folks on any later. And I know you're really late in doing this from India. So thank you so much, Narender, for coming on to Automation Hour so late to present this really cool solution for us. So thank you so much, and have a great weekend, everybody.
You too. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer, and the whole automation team for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, until next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Or maybe see you someone in the trailer DX. Bye bye.